Carlson. Chapter 2. Considering the enormous effect dogs have had on my life, I came to them late and in an odd enough way. I was 40 years old and living in poverty when I first became involved with sled dogs. Writing is a strange way to make a living, and I have sold many books by the time I was 40, but was not making enough money to live on. I worked construction, ran heavy equipment, tracked satellites, taught, did many things to support life. And by the time I was 40, I was working very hard and had almost become completely broke, living with my wife and son in a small cabin in northern Minnesota with no plumbing, no electricity, and no real prospects. And so, to dogs. The state of Minnesota was having a tough time with beavers. They had more or less run amok and were damming up the rivers and flooding highways, filling pastures, even beginning to invade the cities. I had trapped a bit when I was a boy, and to make some money I had decided to trap for the state. The state paid a small bounty, and the pelt brought a similar small amount of money. It was a one-man operation, and not very successful because I ran it on foot, or on a pair of skis when the snow came, and I rarely got over a 20-mile trap line. There was also the difficulty that I had trouble even with trapping and killing. I was not good at it because I did not really want to do it. Some friends heard of my trapping and gave me 4 older dogs. They were Storm, Yogi, Obeah, and Columbia, and a broken sled. The side rails were broken and needed replacement. And so I was into dogs. But of course I was not. I didn't know how to run them or to be run by them. I did not even know how to harness them or hook them properly to the gangline so that pulled the sled when they were harnessed. But I fixed the sled and tried to harness them, and that first time I did not know anything about, well, anything. The dogs were more or less wandered around the yard without leaving, and I thought it was madness to try to use them when the only way they would leave the yard was for me to drag them. After a time, I stopped and sat on a stump and watched them and tried to think of a way to make them run. Finally, I decided you couldn't make them. You had to let them. One of the dogs, Obeah, seemed to be trying to look ahead, and I thought he might want to pull the others, lead them. So I put him in front, and it worked. We left the yard and ran on the trail through the woods, and I thought all the Yukon Kings thoughts there are. I was running a team in the north, and they were out there ahead of me, and it was beautiful, and I knew nothing. I was so ignorant, so steeped in not knowing, that I did not even know what I didn't know. I didn't know what questions to ask, or how to ask them, and I would not begin to learn until Storm taught me. His blood taught me. There will be more about running dogs later, and more about Storm. But for the moment, it is enough to know that when I started, I thought I knew what I was doing. The dogs moved me. I expanded the trap line to nearly 60 miles over the next 3 months. By the middle of hard winter, I thought I was Sergeant Preston, a Mountie on a radio show I had listened to as a child. By this time, I had 3 more dogs, a 7-dog work team, and a tent. Obeah had evolved into something I thought was a good leader. I think this was largely because he looked like a sled dog should look, like Sergeant Preston's kind of sled dog. He was large and wolf-like, with a thick gray mane and a tail that curled over his back. He was standoffish. He did not want to be petted. Now and again he would lift his lip at me, and twice he bit me on the leg. Obeah always wanted to fight the other males, and I thought, mistakenly, that all of this was proper behavior of a sled dog. At least the Yukon King type of sled dog I had always dreamt about. I wasn't trapping very much, and I was running a long distance. It took 3 days to run the 60-mile line, but I confined my running to the daylight. I did not know about using a headlamp, did not know that dogs ran better at night. I would run during the day, work on my trap sets, then pitch a tent and camp at night and harness up and run the next day, and there was a great beauty in that. Sleeping with them. I would fix the tent and arrange my sleeping bag and pad, and then put the dogs around me in a circle just outside the firelight. On truly cold nights, when it dropped to 10 or 15 below, I would bring in several of the dogs into the tent and pack them around the bag tightly and fall asleep with them breathing around me, with their hearts beating against me through the bag, with their souls in the tent with me. They also felt the warmth and would move closer against the bag, jamming into my sides. On one very cold night, it must have been 30 or 35 below, I awakened in the morning with dogs all around me, and 3 of them curled up on top of me, a living blanket. With all this closeness, with all the running, with the dance of the dogs, I thought I knew them, and with that thought, with that attitude, I wasn't learning anything. I just ran the line, took a beaver now and then, and pretended somewhere in my mind that I was Sergeant Preston and had a whole team of kings out in front of me, until Storm taught me. There came a night, finally, when I was about 20 miles from home, and it was very cold, close to 40 below, and rather than spend the night out camping, I decided to run in the dark and go on home. Running sled dogs is much like sailing a boat on the ocean. Distances are almost critically relative. Sailing 100 miles with the wind might take 12 or 14 hours, depending on the wind strength, boat, and sailor. To turn around and sail the same 100 miles against the wind, and especially if there's a current against you, might take 1, even 2 weeks. Indeed, sometimes it simply can't be done, ever. Dogs are much the same. 20 miles with a work team traveling 7 miles an hour, which is about average, would seem to take about 3 hours, and sometimes does. But an inch of new snow to slow the sled, or an extra heavy load to slow it still more, perhaps a headwind to cap it off, and the dogs can only make 3 or 4 miles an hour. Suddenly the trip, the same 20 miles, becomes 5, 6, or even 7-hour run. And on a 7-hour run with a heavy load, it is necessary to stop and rest the dogs, let them sleep for a couple of hours, and feed them. So that adds still more. And all of these things were against me. A run I thought would take 3 hours was in reality going to take me closer to 9 hours, all in the dark, in intense cold, in new snow in what turned out to be hilly country, with a sled that weighed close to 500 pounds, fully loaded. It became one of the longest nights in my life. I did not understand at the time that you should feed the dogs straight raw meat and fat. It is the same as putting gasoline in an engine. Some people actually told me that meat was bad for them and to only feed them dry dog food. I had a sack of dog food with me and fed that to them when I stopped to camp. All wrong. All of it wrong. What I did not know then is that not only should the dogs be fed meat and fat, but most decidedly should not be fed dry dog food when they're going to work hard or be stressed at all. The bits of ground corn used as base for the dog food are worthless and largely indigestible. And they are sharp. When a working dog's stomach tightens, as it does when he pulls, the corn becomes like tiny little knives that cut and tear the insides of his intestines. I knew none of this, and so, to Storm. Storm was an almost classic sled dog. He looked much like a brindle wolf with the beautiful slanted eyes. He had a great reach to his front legs and a thick mane and straight back. In many ways he was still very primitive, but he liked people a great deal and would lean against your leg to be petted. He pulled. Of course they all pull. It is genetic. So old a code or command that it has become part of what sled dogs are, the fibers of their very being. When they are 6 months old, you harness them and pull. There is no training necessary.